lovely mix of panelists. As we were seeing in the previous session, when I was presenting that starting track, how the pie of microfinance has become diversified. NBFC, MFIs, banks, SFBs, and all. And we have NBFC, leading NBFC, MFI, Manoj is there. We have SFB, Bhaskar Babuji is there from Suryodaya. Veena ji will represent the bank side and other softer aspects of microfinance. Jayesh is there from a proper bank side. So we have a 360-degree coverage of the industry. And we will be discussing mainly about the COVID's impact. COVID has been such a, what should I say, humongous impact on the entire globe, that how could microfinance industry be kept away from it? However, as we were seeing in the introduction to our track, that the industry, despite all, as I was saying, that if I would have to be asked that what would be my prognosis in May, I would not have come to this conclusion that we would be in such a good state by January. But it is a very happy state. But we will try to decipher what has been the intricacies, operational intricacies of going through this last journey of 9 months. That is why everybody is here, and we will try to make it enriching discussion. So I will start by giving the floor to each one of you initially to talk briefly about that. How has the COVID impacted microfinance and inclusive finance business in general? A brief introductory remarks from everybody, and then we'll get into specific questions for each one of you. So I will start with, Bhaskar ji.
Thanks, Alok. I think as this event hit us, we were all completely clueless. The visibility was virtually close to zero. And as Alok was mentioning, in May, it looked very, very bleak. How the whole thing will bounce back, how will our customers react to, because they're all used to meeting them in groups. And suddenly we have a scenario where we can't even kind of request them to come for meetings. So from the scenario as it moved each one while they took their path, what really helped is in terms of the government announcing a moratorium, clearly. So that really helped in terms of customers taking the comfort of not being obligated, and they had a breather, and which enabled many of us also to plan accordingly. And as many times it happens in microfinance in our customer segment, pressure in situations like this leads to catastrophes in terms of repayment, in terms of behaviors of the customer, and also because of these invites many local elements into the play. That didn't happen, and that was a good thing. But slowly but steadily, even during the moratorium, there were customers voluntarily making payment. So probably much lesser, 5%, 10%, 15%. It gave the ground for many of us to get prepared to be in touch with the customer across the sector. The happy thing to note is that the customer connect continued to be happening even when the repayments were not coming in. That gave comfort to the customer segment, that gave comfort to our field force, and across the board, the employees were taken care. They were not forced to go into the field. All the due cares were taken across all institutions, be it banks or microfinance institutions. That comfort building phase of 3 to 4 months lasting till August helped the customers to come back slowly but steadily. Certainly, what was not predicted is the quickness with which the rebound will take place. And fortunately, we did not see many local disturbances across, except from the interaction between the customers and the institutions. So the bounce back has been steady. Have we really come out of the woods? Not yet. It will take a few more months, a quarter or so, but the direction has been fairly positive. So that's our experience, Alok.
Thank you. Manoj ji, your comments on this? Has he logged out? Or?
No.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think Bhaskar has set a good context. This is a very high-touch business, and to that extent, not being able to call your customers for a meeting, not being able to collect and keep the same discipline, obviously is a huge disruption. And like he said, I think as events unfolded, right from March last week when the lockdown was announced to the RBI moratorium that we all had to sort of deal with, to the extension of the moratorium which happened in end of May, right? It's been a very, very learning experience. And as you rightly said, it's an unprecedented situation. So it's been a huge amount of learning for all of us. But I think the resilience of the microfinance customer should not be sort of discounted. We really depend on that fragile shoulders to actually rest our business on. And I think the sort of reaction from all of them during the moratorium, when people continue to make payments, understanding fully well that when you make your payment, your outstandings will go down, your interest burden will go down. And of course, September, when the full demand has been raised, right, the kind of cooperation and enthusiasm to pay has been there. I wouldn't say, like you said rightly, that we have reached back to the 99% kind of collection efficiency that the sector is famous for. But day by day, week by week, month by month, the improvement has been there. And we certainly hope that in this quarter, which is very critical, Jan, Feb, March, should be able to close the year, getting back to pure normalcy on both collections and disbursements.
Thank you. Thank you. Veena ji, what is your view?
Thank you, Alok. I'll talk a little bit about, the people in the business, because as both Manoj and Bhaskar pointed out, this is really a high-touch people business. I think the customers have been the ones who have really responded in a manner which is positive, because I think the high touch of the microfinance loan officers, the staff at branches, managed to sort of reinforce certain confidence that they were there for the long term. And whatever disruption is going to happen, they are going to be supporting customers. I think that gave a lot of confidence to customers. There was, however, one aspect which customers did have confusion about, was whether they should accept the moratorium and not accept the moratorium. And there, I think education played a good part. MFIN also came out with a lot of messages in various languages, which their members could use to, really tell customers what the impact was, what they could do, what they could not do, and kept reassuring them that, once things became a little better, disbursements would also start, because that is a big worry for customers, that will we get access to liquidity again. The other aspect, I think, on the people business was employees. And there was, of course, this nervousness amongst employees that should they go to work, should they not go to work, how do they actually cope with the group mechanism? And I think digitization took a massive leap in this time. People who were experimenting with digitization fast-tracked it, started to have, much more telecalling contacts with customers, smaller sort of interactions with customers rather than meeting them in groups. And all of that has helped. But maybe as we go along the session, we can talk later about some of the negative aspects that customers have faced. But one of the things which has been very important is the large gap between the digitization capability that the institutions have and the digital literacy that customers have. And I think this is one aspect that the industry will have to address sooner rather than later. I think in this last 10 months, digitization has taken a leap almost 5 years forward. What would have perhaps taken 5 years has taken hardly 8 to 10 months. It has not penetrated completely down to the customer. And that is one aspect I think the industry should look at very closely going forward.
Thank you.
I'll stop here for now.
Very important point you talked about. We'll come back to you on the education part of the client and the gap between the digital initiatives which are taking place and the literacy levels of digital, especially the digital literacy and infrastructure availability at the client level. I will come back to you on that point. Very interesting point. Though we have a separate track on digital initiatives by microfinance, but we'll briefly discuss that. So Jayesh, what your overall views, opening comments?
Yeah. So one thing which we could see is that this time not the only microfinance sector was impacted due to pandemic, but across the entire financial institution, this issue was there. Okay, so it was not just a microfinance issue. The good part which we could see is that at least in the microfinance sector side, both the institutions came together, Saadhan and MFIN. Quickly, all the MFIs came together. I think there was no panic at all, which was there. So when we used to speak to the MFIs, there was no any panic, neither from the lender side nor from their side to the customers. I think the past experience which the sector has gone through, I think one of the things which was very, very clearly kept focused was the customer. That if the customer is being kept calm, it's not being bothered at this time, things will come under control and things will be in place. And the second is the staff. So this too, I think we could see a clear focus and clear initiatives taken by the sector, which could not be the case in various other sectors. Like if there's no any such common practice for NBFCs or HFCs, but for NBFC, MFI at least, this was one thing which we could see there was a consistent message coming from whichever institutions we talked to. So if we have spoken to only 2 MFI institutions, we'll know what is the plan of action which the other 6 are, or other 10 or other 20 are going to take. So I think that consistency and the messaging was very, very clear and very positive. I think that's one thing which laid a path, and then balance all things fall in place. That's what we could see.
Thank you. Now getting into the specifics, first I will come to Manoj, because NBFC MFI is you do not have a deposit base. You have to depend on borrowings, and repayments from clients are your major source of cash flow, running cash flow. But in case of moratorium, which was first 3 months, it went up to 6 months. So I would like you to tell with a little bit of flavor, how did you survive this moratorium period on liquidity front?
Yeah, no, Alokji, that's a very interesting question. And obviously, when the lockdown happened end of March, right? The month of March had almost been finished, and the announcement even from the RBI came on the 25th of March. So to that extent, the collections for that month were pretty much over, right? So at least as far as 19-20 financial year was concerned, more or less we had closed the year except for that last week, which was pending. The real issue started from April, because after 25th of March till pretty much end of April, it was a complete lockdown. The unlock process only started in the last week, and that too, there was a lot of conditions about the red and green zones and all of that, right? So by the time we could get the staff back into the branches, sanitize the branches, get the staff back, and like Vinaji rightly said, move the phone call center meetings that we were doing to physical meetings, right? It was pretty much, I would say, mid of May. Right. So on one hand, being an NBFC MFI without deposits, we have to depend on bank loans. And there, obviously, there is a fixed repayment schedule which has already been agreed with the lender. Right. Now, the unfortunate part was, while the announcement clearly gave the end customers a possibility of speaking to their lender and then availing of the moratorium, that particular aspect was not clear as far as companies like us were concerned. So to that extent, bankers were also not very clear whether this was an automatic facility or it needed to be applied. While all of us applied for that benefit, right? I would say that not more than, initially in the initial phase, not more than 30-40% actually got that benefit, right? Post that, we had to intervene, we had to speak to the RBI, we had to sort of speak to the IBA, which is the Bankers Association, and try to explain to them that, like you rightly said, if there is no collection from the field, then how do you actually make the repayments to the loans that you've already taken? In spite of that, post the extension which happened in May, I would say the percentage from 30-40% moved to about 50-60%, but nowhere was it 100%. Especially, I would say, given the smaller and the medium-sized MFIs. While the larger ones had larger net worth, they probably had funding lines available. They were carrying forward some sanctions and cash from March into April, right? I would say what really helped us there was the fact that the RBI announced the TLTRO facility, right? The RBI announced the special liquidity facility through NABARD, SIDBI and Mudra. And to that extent, it was at least one could get credit lines, right, in order to ensure that this mismatch between collections not being there, and collections even when it started in May, I would say was about 20-30%, and then growing to 40, 50, 60, by the time we finished August, which was the extended moratorium. So this particular mismatch was primarily managed through the net worth of individual companies, through the sanctions and cash that we were carrying forward, and the additional lines which came in because of the special facilities announced by the RBI. In the second phase of moratorium, if you remember, there was also some measures announced by the Government of India in terms of the partial credit guarantee scheme, right? And because it was actually routed through the PSU banks, companies like us, which had a strong PSU linkage, were able to take benefit of that. And I would say at least for a company like us, because we were reasonably medium plus kind of size, right? We are actually carrying excess liquidity right now with sanctions and cash, right? Because of the fact that disbursements have not really come back to full normalcy. So to that extent, it's been relatively easier for large and the upper middle kind of companies. The middle size, medium sized and the smaller size have struggled, right? So I would say the larger MFIs, the carving out of the TLTRO in the second round for the small MFIs, even the special liquidity facility, special facility for the small and medium sized ones certainly have helped. But if you were very close to your capital adequacy, if you were not carrying forward cash sanctions at the time that the lockdown was announced, you did go through very, very anxious moments, because the last thing that you want to do is to sort of renege on a payment that you need to do, right? Because that will then be captured for posterity, and you will continue to explain to people why you could not make that payment. So I wish the whole sequence was orchestrated a bit better, because when you're all facing a tough situation on the field, to have additional pressure on you as to how you will pay back the lenders who probably would not give you moratorium, right, is not something that you would want to go through again.
Thank you. Thank you, Manoj. I will come back to you on TLTRO and special liquidity and PCGC. But I was just wondering, because you said you gave a new dimension to it. You said that the larger ones mainly manage the mismatch because repayments not coming, but repayment to lenders continuing. And touchwood, we did not see any default in the sector, credit default by NBFC MFI. I was thinking about somebody was putting a conjecture that maybe the percentage of repayments to lenders almost matched with repayment from clients that helped the medium and lower side to survive rather than the capital buffer, because the collections, except for a very brief period, I think 15-20 days initial, that strict hard lockdown, it never completely dried up. So would you agree to that, or you would say that still it is the capital and the additional lines which kept you afloat, especially the smaller ones? Yeah.
So Alokji, the collections, when we opened up in April, all of us were in very low single digits, right? We ourselves were hardly crossed even sort of 5% in that month. Hardly 1 week was available. Even in May, I would say by the time we managed to open the branches, going out into the field to meet customers was not easy. So like Veena said, a lot of us fast-tracked the cashless repayment mechanisms that we were able to offer to the customers. That again has its own challenges, because the bank account needs to be funded. There is an additional cost, right, which needs to be picked up. All of them may not be comfortable in the same way in terms of using the smart, measures in terms of payment. I would say April, May, June, certainly there was a fair amount of mismatch between what we were collecting to what we were paying, right? June, July onwards, when the momentum sort of came back, and as you also said, 40, 50%, 60% we were collecting. And if you had received 40, 50% sort of moratorium from your lenders, then there was at least a match in terms of what you were collecting to what you were paying. But please also remember that we've got operating expenses, right? So we need to pay our rentals on time, because that also is a statutory liability. You need to pay your salaries on time, right? And like Veena rightly said, keeping the employees motivated in this very difficult situation, which is unprecedented for all of us, right, was also equally challenging. While I'm not trying to say that they were trying to apply for new jobs and move, but keeping them motivated about the fact that the sector will come back, the opening up will happen, it will be a learning experience for you, learn new things rather than trying to panic. All of that, including training sessions, the health issue, right? I mean, as a company, we've had till today 350 infections, right? I mean, in terms of a field force of almost about 5,500-6,000 people. Now, how to make them go out into the field? We are all sitting very comfortably at work from home, kind of scenario. But for them, there's nothing called work from home. It is work from the field. So they have to be in the field. Now, in that interacting with customers, going through the whole sort of travel process, interacting with customers, getting the money, interacting with other people in the branch, it's very difficult, especially at that point of time where the medical protocol was also not readily available.
True.
Even fighting to ensure that you don't get infected.
True. Thank you. Bhaskarji, as a bank, though the name is Small Finance Bank, but you are virtually a bank, almost a bank. So in that case, did you see any difference or did you also face any stress because of the repayments moratorium, or it was comfortable because you have access to deposits base? Any differences you see with what Manoj has talked about NBFC MFIs, the bank?
Not really, Alok. I think that was the benefit, as you kind of explained in your kind of preamble. Is that unlike NBFC, since we have the access to the last mile deposits, that kept coming as business as usual. What probably many of the small finance banks did is that we went and tapped the lines which was available to us from multilateral institutions, refinancing institutions like NABARD and SIDBI. So as Manoj was explaining, we all got loaded up with a lot more liquidity than was required. So our entire balance sheet today has 20% excess liquidity, and that has its own negative carry impact issues, which kind of hits the profitability when already the profitability is low. But for that, I think across the banking sector, liquidity management was not an issue. To that extent, as Manoj mentioned, the focus was in terms of the other side of the balance sheet, connecting up with the customers and doing it, and not so much in terms of liquidity management.
Okay. Very brief and to the point, as always. Jayesh, I will come to you because you are a bank as well as a lender to the sector also. So you have two parts to your question. First, do you see any difference but though you partly answered it in your first question, that you didn't see much of a difference in the response of different NBFC MFIs to whom you lend, but do you still see a difference in the performance? And if yes, what are the reasons? And second, as a bank, compared to, we all say that whatever data we get, we say that the microfinance is still, despite COVID in times, it has proved that it is one of the best performing asset class in finance business. Do you agree with that, looking from the bank's perspective?
Yeah. So Alok, to answer your first part, I think one of the things which we saw was that each NBFC MFI had a different strategy for the liquidity management. Okay. Given that nobody had anticipated that the pandemic will be there, there are certain NBFC MFIs who are very conservative with the cost, and they are very tight on liquidity, because one of the things which they always think is that liquidity is available on tap. Whenever we need, we'll get it. So there were few NBFC MFIs who had kept that very tight one. The good part was that the Reserve Bank came with the adequate support. Otherwise, it could have been a challenge. It could have been challenged with few one. So I think this was one thing which few MFIs had to build up a quick liquidity buffer from a liquidity standpoint of view. And I think all the lending institutions were aware that the sector is doing fine. And again, I mentioned it was not just microfinance sector, but we were seeing all other lenders having similar challenge. So I think it got supported. Okay, that's part one. As far as the customer part is concerned, I think all the NBFC MFIs were very, except one or two who quickly went to the field to collect it. I think most of them agreed to take a view as when is the right time to go, keep the customer connect and keep on being in touch with the customer. And once things open up, I think everybody went to the field. Okay, so I think in both sides, from the customer management point of view, I think the except one or two, most of them had a consistent approach. On the borrowing side or borrowing from the institutions, I think people had, because March had just gone. Anyhow, in March, most of the banks give a lot of funding because of the PSL requirements and all that. So I think that went through. But I think one thing which they've learned is that yes, liquidity cost which needs to be kept, so that in case if such short-term issue comes, because it was just a 3-month short-term issue, could be managed. So that's the part A. Part two to your question, Alok, can you repeat it?
I said that because as a bank you see various asset classes. Will you agree with the statement that microfinance has performed better among the financial asset class?
Yeah, sure. So, so for us, most of our customers have been able to manage it. But yeah, if we see the trend, I think we didn't expect the microfinance sector to come so quickly back. Being an unsecured portfolio, okay, there's no security, and within that, it came back to such a drastic collection performance was excellent. The good part was that when we were asking for projections, okay, and month on month, or in fact we used to monitor week on week and fortnight on fortnight, we were hitting those projections. We were just meeting it. So I think that gave further confidence that yes, things are in place and whatever activities are done on the ground are working. So yes, microfinance, and you have even covered in your own analysis that this sector has come up much better than any other asset class.
Thank you. So Vinayji, coming to you, because I do not know whether it is appropriate, but you can share your experiences because you sit on the board of RBL FinServe, and you also are part of MFIN's EC committee, so you can speak from both sides. But I would like you to speak the experience of BC from perspective that though it is not a typical BC because the bank is behind it, it is a fully owned BC of the bank. But did you face the BC faced any challenges, or the challenges were similar to what other speakers have talked about?
So, Alok, I think the advantage to the BC is that the liquidity challenge was not as severe, because you're able to really tap the liquidity from a full-fledged commercial bank who also got the benefit of refinancing lines, etc., from SIDBI, NABARD. So liquidity-wise, I think the BC is fared better. But if you look at credit and the repayment challenges, as well as the challenges of managing the customer, I think all of those challenges were the same as far as BC or an MFI or an SFB is concerned. So the other issue which I would like to maybe touch upon, we've talked a lot about liquidity, but I think, and we've also talked about the fact that the MFI sector has been the one that has performed better than most asset classes. But I think we should not forget the fact, and particularly when looking at NBFC MFIs, that credit quality is not necessarily just a function of your internal ability to assess and collect. In the MFI sector, credit quality is very much also affected by external factors. And we have seen in the last decade that the maximum impact on credit quality has actually been external factors. So whether it was starting with, the crisis with the regulations brought on and, the Andhra crisis, or whether it was DeMon, or whether it was, the citizen agitation in Assam, whether it was cyclones. So this causes a lot of stress to the sector. And particularly for NBFC MFIs, the pricing mechanisms that regulation has put on the sector is actually harmful, because investors then look at it and say, okay, the smaller MFIs, are they able to meet the credit costs of the external risk that is being, experienced? And in terms of pricing, in the last 1 year, if you see, the base rate has gone from 9% to, above 9% to just above 7%. But there is no change in the margin at all, whereas your credit costs are being increasing. So I think regulation-wise, you have to treat the entire sector, as you said even earlier on in the earlier session when you were talking about the microfinance sector, on an activity basis. And therefore give the room to the NBFC MFIs to also be able to absorb the increased credit costs without having to necessarily lower pricing because interest rates have come down. And this did not happen in DeMon. This has not happened now. I think this is one of the very major stress points for the sector. And it is very necessary that we have small NBFCs, we have small MFIs, we have large MFIs, because all of them have a different approach to the sector or to the customer. They have different, areas, geographic or particular, aspects that they adhere to. And really it's, we must encourage and allow to flourish all sizes of players. Only then will you get innovation. So I think this is one aspect the regulator needs to look at, apart from that 85% cap that you also spoke about. And I think these two issues will not allow a level playing field unless they are addressed.
Okay. So you went on to, thank you, Binaji, you went on to a level playing field issue, which is a very, what should I say, a very hot topic. And the main issue is, as you said, that you are basically saying let 1,000 flowers bloom. And that is the phrase which I remember was used by Dr. Y.V. Reddy when the 1998, I think, Kalia Committee report on self-regulation was placed. It is many, those who are new entrants may not remember that, 22 years, it is already 22 years behind. And in that, they wanted to come up with self-regulation and some regulatory guidelines, and being in NABARD, I was part of it. And ultimately, Y.V. Reddy said that let 1,000 flowers bloom. So that philosophy in 22 years, I think we have moved from small is beautiful to big is beautiful sort of thing in pricing. And the bigger problem in the base rate downward revision along with economic rates is fine. But base rates, decrease in base rates do not translate into the actual lending rate. That is the problem. Because when the base rates increase, they translate into the lending rates. But when they decrease, they don't translate into the lending rates. Right. And what RBI Reserve Bank in its technical jargon says about transmission loss or transmission time period, that's another issue which we cannot get into this session, but a very vital point you have talked about. And that is hurting the sector, especially now that MFI pricing is based on two formulas. If you are less than 100 crores, it has to be cost of fund plus 10% or base rate into 2.75, whichever is lower. And for MFIs above 100 crores, 10%, and into base rate into 2.75, whichever is lower. But now for all the classes of MFIs, base rate into 2.75 has become the cap. So for a 10,000 crore MFI, 21.8 is the ultimate lending rate maximum. And even for a 75 crore or 50 crore also, so that is hurting. So hopefully Bank of India will look into it, a very vital issue. Now coming back to Manoj, you talked about TLTRO and SLF. So you can talk about it, how it helped the sector. But I will also have one question to you before you start, which you can cover also. Because the whatever data I have and the field experiences, it says that the TLTRO and SLF has mainly gone towards top 50% of the sector, and it has not actually reached the 50% sector.
Yeah, no. So Alokji, I think the key difference between an on-lending loan and a TLTRO or even the PCG is the fact that you suddenly moved from an on-lending balance sheet item to an investment item, right? So suddenly in a TLTRO, because you're issuing securities, the decision-making authority in a bank essentially becomes a treasury. While they will obviously interact with the credit department and the people who've given the wholesale loan to the MFI, right? But it's an investment product. So for the first time, and while a lot of us had issued NCDs and things like that earlier, including CPs by some large institutions, right? The key form of borrowing continued to be on borrowing from the banks. But under the TLTRO, what happened is that suddenly a new avenue opened up. And because the money essentially was being funded by the RBI at a reasonable rate, one expected that companies which would get it, especially in terms of their credit rating and their size, would obviously be able to avail it at a lower rate of interest, right? So I would say what has really happened is that, one, the on-lending relationship, whatever was there as of March, continued, and then you had this additional facility called TLTRO, which was then an investment product. Your point is right, that at the end of the day, when you announce something, the flight of capital will go to the highly funded strong net worth, highly rated institutions in the first recourse, and then it will slowly start trickling down, right? But that trickling down effect did not pass, I would say, a certain level of the medium-sized institutions and go down the line, because most of them were not even rated, or even if they were rated, they were actually, the ratings were low enough that it could not withstand, let's say, an investment product from a bank, right? So, which is the reason why in the second phase, we requested the RBI and they created a carve out of an X percentage, which would then specially go to the smaller, small and medium sized MFIs. Even after the liquidity facility, if you remember, while it started off with a general purpose liquidity facility being available, but the same thing happened again, as you said. The larger ones garnered bulk of that, right? And the smaller ones are, were actually deprived until again in the second phase, they carved out an amount and said this has to go to institutions of a certain size and below, right? Now, this is an ongoing issue that will always keep happening. It will happen even under the PSL that Jayesh was mentioning, that you would essentially look at a reasonably sized institution with a good credit rating that you can be comfortable on once the asset class is actually a tick, right? And it takes a certain amount of effort, like you rightly said, to move through the NBFC funding, which is the first port of call, to then DFIs, to then private sector banks, and then finally hitting the PSU bank network, right? Because the PSUs tend to be far more conservative, but the good news is once you establish a relationship, then it keeps getting renewed at a higher limit every year, as long as the company is doing well, right? But so these are all rites of passage. At the end of the day, we all started small with a zero portfolio at some point of time, and have gone through these rites of passage in terms of being where we are today.
Okay. Now, Bhaskar ji, during this, while liquidity you talked about earlier, Manoj ji has talked about in detail about it. During this COVID times, the government also announced the schemes like ex gratia relief, difference between compound interest and simple interest to be paid into the clients. Mudra interest subvention, if you are regular in repayment, I think 2% subvention you get from Mudra. I wanted to take your views because there is a counter view that this is too much of work for too little benefit. On a client loan outstanding of 20,000 rupees, if you get a rebate of 70 rupees or 60 rupees, and for that the back end process and all that you have to do and claim and reimbursement, what is your view on that?
Well, look, it is, not that it isn't, but some of the things when they are kind of designed tend to miss out the small intricacies. For instance, ECGLS was supposed to be for 20% of the principal outstanding as of February 28th. We wanted to kind of roll it out to all our customers, but when we started looking at the principal outstanding at 10,000 was, you can give 2%, 20% of it is 2,000. Not really worth it for the customer, not worth for the institution. So we did make a representation while ECLGS will have 20%. Can we just keep a minimum limit of 10,000? So obviously it got lost in the crowd. But the intent of the government is good. So in spite of that, I think we have done as a bank around 50,000 customers ECLGS, wherever the principal outstanding was more than 30,000. 6,000 rupees at 9.25 for 4 years, 1 year, on interest payment. On the interest subvention, too little for sure. But yeah, quite a bit of a work, including taking statutory certificate, giving it and giving a credit to all of them, including an SMB. Not all the customers have your bank account. So you'll have to collect that, give them the credit, and it is too small even for the customer. I think it was designed obviously not for this kind of volume, but it is our duty to kind of ensure that even if it is small amount, it gets credited. Quite a bit of work for sure.
Okay. So you're saying work, but still in parts beneficial.
Yes, it is.
In parts beneficial. Okay. Vinay ji, because as you know, the ex gratia scheme of government, which came out, it said that you have to pay back the difference between, as part of Supreme Court hearing, the difference between compound interest and simple interest. Now, what the sense which I got, the sector as such was a bit confused, that many said that we don't charge compound interest. Then what is the interest to be credited? What is the difference to be credited? How do you look upon it? Because some have commented that was it a way that the compound interest has been legitimized? From a banking perspective, how do you see that?
So, from a banking perspective, I would say compound interest is always legitimate, because We are in the business of lending money, and therefore, if money is out, interest on interest is really interest on, the commodity that you have lent out. However, this, the most MFIs and a number of banks as well have the system of, when customers, for example, make advance payments, they do get the credit of that at the time the EMI is then deducted. Similarly, if a customer makes a late payment, there is a certain amount of interest which is charged on that. I think the biggest problem is with the system. It's not the concept, that there are two problems that come up with this. One is, how do you adjust your backend systems to do this? And you've got so many, the volume of the accounts is so large. And the second is the understanding at the customer level. You are actually creating confusion for the future, because now you're putting into, as it is, we've had a long time during which we have explained to the customer what is the difference between a flat rate of interest and what is the difference between a reducing balance interest, and convinced her that, when we charge 26% reducing balance, it is much less than 2% flat interest or 5% flat interest on the month, in a month. Now you try and tell her that I've been charging you interest on interest. The concept itself, we found, creates a lot of confusion. And now talking not as a banker, but as, somebody who works in the area of financial education, this has been one of the hardest things to explain. It was easy to explain to the customer that, look, if you don't pay your EMI, there is going to be an interest charged on it. She understood it. Then you tell her that you are actually paying interest on interest. It's a very difficult concept to further explain to the customer. And I think this confusion can be avoided, as well as the quantum of the refunds, if you look at them, will be extremely small.
So more of work, less of benefit. Yeah. So Jayesh, I would come to you summarizing these things, that yes, the government tried, if I see, a twin policy. One is the liquidity flow for the microfinance sector, liquidity flow, whether it was through PCGC, TLTRO, or special liquidity funds. They tried to boost in liquidity. And the second measure was not only to provide liquidity, which goes towards fresh credit for clients, also to provide some sort of relief, whether it is interest subvention, whether it is ex gratia, some sort of a relief goes to the client in actual monetary terms. In some substance, what my previous three speakers have spoken is that while the liquidity support was difficult, which we have tried to change it, but these measures of client relief, they're too much of work and less of benefit. What is your view on it, and what do you think if I give you the policymaker's hat, what you would have done extra to revive the sector?
Okay, so Alok, two things which we will have done. One, if this is the thought process which any of the government and the policymakers had, okay, if this would have been told in advance, okay, this will have at least helped the banks and the various institutions to get ready with. As one of the earlier speaker mentioned that for last 70 years, such restructuring on a massive scale had never happened. Okay, so if this is happening, the technology, the systems, and everything needs to get geared up, and it will have given some time. Other it becomes chaotic. That's a. Second, see, if you see, even just I can give you an example of, say, a PTC, a pass-through certificates, okay, which many banks invest into. Okay, if you see, the underlying customer has gone through the moratorium, okay, but the expectation is that the investment which the bank or the investor holds, it should not go through moratorium. It has to get regularly paid either through treating as a default or to draw the credit enhancement. I think one thing which if as a policymaker, one thing which you have to see, that anything which affects the customer, anything which is related to that, any instruments, any policy which is related to that, end to end, everybody has to be taken care into. So So these are the few things which I think maybe it was the first time as a learning, but these are the few things which we could address. The other, though it's not a related topic, but I'll just bring it over here since we are on this. On the MSME reclassification, okay, we have got a new guideline where the borrower or a borrower will be treated only a micro, small, or medium enterprise once it gets registered as Udyam. Okay, now the Udyam side is not able to register individuals. Where is the entire Mudra, entire microfinance portfolio which caters to micro enterprises? How that is going to get qualified and reported? No answer. So these are the few things which what sector, any policy change which does, maybe if the people who are going to implement it or the people who are going to at the ground do it, if they have been talked to, they've been taken into confidence, I think things could be much better.
Great.
Hope it answers your question.
Manoj, you wanted to say something?
No, 2 points, Alokji. One is I slightly differ that the benefit of the Shishu Mudra interest subsidy, the RBI relief product, which was there again, limited to people who were sort of regular as of 1st of March, and the Supreme Court, compounding interest relief, which is there. While I do understand that if your institution is not properly IT enabled, it will mean a lot of work in terms of doing the calculation, getting it certified and sort of claiming it. But what we have done is to smartly use that as a very strong message from the Government of India, from the RBI, from people like SIDBI and Mudra to say all benefits will only go to regular customers, right? This is aiding the fact that be on the right side of 90, never cross that 90 line, which is the NPA line, which is exactly what we're trying to do even in CRR, right? So the benefit of the RBI relief product went only to 30 DPD and less. The Mudra Shishu subsidy went only to people who were 90 minus, right? Who had not been declared as an NPA. And even the Supreme Court compounding interest benefit only went to customers who were regular, who had not crossed 90. This is a very, very strong message, and we've discussed this in MFIN as well, to create a very strong repayment discipline. In fact, Veena-ji very nicely spoke about the fact that NBFC MFIs are very tightly regulated. And we've been speaking internally as well that it is 10 years of Maligram Committee report. It is time that the sector is given freedom to actually fly on its wings, right? Responsible finance is already there. It needs to be tracked, but you can't stifle the business. So the 2 pillars that Maligram Committee report spoke about was client protection on one side and institutional viability on the other. For the sake of one, we have sacrificed the other. Right? So today, even if large institutions, which earlier did not have a problem and were at least enjoying that full 10% margin, are not able to enjoy that because the base rate has come down and what we can charge is 21.88. Right? I think the understanding has to be there. So the overall issue, like Jayesh mentioned about the synchronization and all of that, is the fact that because we are such a small sector in the overall scheme of things, it doesn't tend to get the attention or the preparatory work that it deserves. But the clients that we deal with, 60 million clients, are obviously very, very sensitive, very, very, a segment which needs to be taken care of. What surprises me is the fact that you have IBA, you have MFIN, you have Sadhan, you have FIDC, you have the Small Finance Bank Association of India today. So people are available to talk. It is not that you need to make 100 calls to understand what will be the impact of this particular regulation or change. But that the approach has to be that of collaboration rather than issuing something and then trying to clarify, by which time the damage is already done.
Okay. So Manoj, I will leave you because otherwise we will get into another track because regulatory issues and all that. I know these are the pain points and very valid points, but we'll leave it at there because that is a topic of a separate discussion. Now we have discussed the effect of it. We have also discussed the liquidity measures and support measures. Now let us go to the aftermath of it. Bhaskar ji, I will come to you. That liquidity measures were announced and we talked about coping up and all those things. But finally, there is genuine livelihood stress. COVID has impacted clients. There cannot be two doubts about it. And we cannot expect 99%, 95% recovery at all places because clients are under stress. Now, the RBI came up with a resolution plan for loans. That is on August 6th circular, which I'm talking about. What is it? Has it been beneficial? Is also more? Has it?
Yes, Alok. I think institutions have taken calls based on various circulars. As Jayesh was mentioning, whether they are micro enterprises, whether they come under SME restructuring, I think the discussion is still on. So each one has kind of taken their path in terms of doing what's kind of good for the customer. But given that the transaction loan sizes are very low, in fact, the overall, as Manoj was mentioning, 60 million customers, 6 crore, 2,20,000 average loan outstanding per customer or per household, as well as microfinance is less than 40,000, around 40. So given that, I think more important than restructuring was in terms of liquidity infusion. As long as you kind of did that and gave another loan, and the amount of installment too small. So already 6 months of moratorium, another 6 months is not really going to truly help. Instead, it will kind of give the customer 12 months of non-repayment surrender to come back. I think each one have kind of found their ways in terms of doing it. The only thing is that it should not, either from the regulator or otherwise, be seen as evergreening. So if you mix evergreening of what funding another loan to be treated as evergreening, I think you lost the concept. Because these micro entrepreneurs, maybe we'll have to create one separate segment for this, to what Jayesh was mentioning, as instead of micro, probably it has to be micro M square segment. And that segment, all of this liquidity infusion will not be treated as kind of an equivalent of evergreening as it would happen in companies. All they need is a flow for the business to kick started. Probably one of the reasons why the sector also has rebounded so quickly. You'll have to kind of look back. The practical experience kind of tells us probably the capital loss out of this lockdown has been very minimal. It is money that lost out of not giving the time, and the bounce back has been pretty quick. So get back into the feet at least while. The other thing probably microfinance institutions have done, whether call it restructuring or not, nobody is going behind the customer to repay all the pending installments. Come current, keep paying the current installment as long as you pay, and then cover part of the installment next month, and then you come back on track. Except for 90 plus, I think it has kind of happened so well. So we have not, as an India, I'm not sure about what each other institution have done. Ours has been in terms of we introduced a scheme called Smile OD, small ticket OD for 5,000, 10,000. Now currently we'll give for 15,000. This I think is a mini innovation of every institution does. Is that mostly microfinance loans are given when the client is ready, when you are ready, when the group is ready. So we wouldn't have introduced this, but for this pandemic, we said kind of introduce where the customer can take the loans when they want to, and they pay interest only to the time they introduce. And after introducing, we did realize that customers were not standing in the queue to draw out the entire amount given. They picked out, and the average utilization is less than 40%.
Okay. So, Bhaskar, but two supplementary questions to you. One, can you throw some light on, because the RBI's resolution or restructuring framework, the word used by RBI is resolution, but we commonly say it as restructuring for the audience. Why does it not include agri loans?
I think the speed with which, while we can say that they should consider what I think looks like what is really needed. I think Manoj mentioned that, or yes mentioned, or we need to kind of have us, while you can say that 2 lakh out of 100 lakh crore of 110 lakh of bank loans is only 2%. The number of constituents is around 6 crore on a household level. Multiply by 5, 30 crores divided by 140 crore. It's around closer to 25% of the population is what we are catering to. Technically means 1 out of every 100 is your 200 Indian citizens is a microfinance customer. The policy framework for everything you do probably will have to have a separate track for small ticket loans.
But
it kind of gets missed out when you look at a larger picture. When you look at a resolution or a restructuring, you don't really probably know for the policy makers the 40,000 overall indebtedness 1 lakh doesn't really figure.
Or was it mainly because most of the agriculture loans, except the investment credit part of agriculture, the short-term agriculture loans are now mainly given by banks through KCC, and it is already a perennial credit limit. Was that the reason for keeping it away from the resolution framework?
At least the credit bureau scrubs don't really kind of show that more than 10% of our 6 crore customers have a KCC. Of course, we'll have to kind of factor in the fact that our credit bureau...
You are saying 10%?
It will be much less than 10%.
Because when you said 10%, it was a double validation to years, because though it is a bit digressing from the topic, because in India we have around 140 million farmers. And as per published records of NABARD and RBI, there are 77 million KCC cards issued. So that means around 50% of farmers should be covered. But in the 2 year back, NABARD had done an All India National Financial Inclusion Survey, NAFIS. It found out that only 10% farmers had KCC. So it tallies with your figure. That's why I wanted to mention that.
Oh, I didn't have the benefit of your knowledge on statistics, certainly for sure. But this is based on our credit bureau scrubs. What we do is I don't really see anything. Probably, except for the fact that we'll have to dissolve scrub with the analysis done on the data of the women of the household, and probably cases is given to the man of the household, not sure. But also I have to really keep in mind that many of the microfinance customers are not necessarily landowners. They work, they do part-time, they're agri-related, agri-allied, and not necessarily agri-landowners.
Yeah.
Probably, so I don't have the full data, but probably by data it shows that probably there's a linkage.
And I will hold you further on that, because you made in your opening statements, you made a very interesting comment that resolution plans should not be conflated with evergreening. So can you give me specific examples of, for the benefit of the audience and for me also, that what is the difference between a genuine resolution and an evergreening in numbers?
Yeah, let's put it along. So the customer has taken a 20,000 rupees loan, and the principal outstanding keeps coming down. Let's assume for a moment that it's 2,000 per month. Even when the principal outstanding is 4,000, the obligation remains 2,000. So suppose you want to now give another loan of 40,000 or 30,000, and then the EMI will be 2,000 plus 3,000 makes it 5,000. So you give the customer an option to pre-close the loan. And unlike a corporate, they will not come back with that 4,000 pending and then close a loan and then take another loan. It becomes too tedious for them. So generally what microfinance institutions or banks in this space do is that you net it off and give it. For a typical mini corporate or even SME, you can call it as evergreening, because you're giving a loan to get the loan. But the fact is that the track record of the customer is 1, not 0, not even 1 plus. Continuously paying, but instead of burdening it, which in a typical parlance is evergreening, you give one loan and that gets used to kind of close. Here in this case, you are kind of making it simple of one installment for all the loans, consolidation of loans to be treated as differently from giving your loan to kind of repay the other loan or repay the installments of the previous loan. I think that is what I call it as a small distinguishing, probably MFIN or other associations or research bodies. We have to come how the financial planning, as Veena rightly really mentioned, this is a very different kind of a segment. They are kind of coming up. If you apply the same formula which will apply for the regular borrower who is borrowing in 3 lakhs and 4 lakhs, apply to 20,000, 30,000, it becomes confusing. And since it is quoted on paper that this be treated as evergreening, probably it will get mistaken to be evergreening.
Veena ji, because you have been a very ardent votary of client protection, so picking up on Bhaskar's point, what do you agree with this difference between a genuine restructuring and an evergreening, or you have some other views? And what is going on in the field?
So, I think what's happening in the field largely, and no sort of observation on what Bhaskar has said. I think people are coming up with different ways, but a lot of it is evergreening. What is happening in the field, and the way to actually sort of do it is the way Bhaskar has said, is to look at what is the repayment capacity, and maybe there has to also be some amount of longer term credit along with a type of an emergency credit or an overdraft. And again, it brings me back to a point that you had spoken about, or I think Alok had spoken about, Alok Prasad had spoken about earlier, is that the JLG business needs to be reinvented. And I think part of that will happen when you can start structuring products which are suited to the various needs of the JLG customer, than just making them all borrow in a group a standard amount for a standard period of time. And therefore, I think what Bhaskar is saying is where you start saying that, okay, you take a loan now and pay for it only when you actually draw the funds and when you need them is one of the ways to go forward and avoid the evergreening.
So, madam, are you saying that most of the restructuring which is going on currently is evergreening?
I'm not saying most of it, but a large part of it is.
A large part of it. There's a very thin difference between large and most. Large will become most. That will be.
Our customers, unfortunately, Alok, sometimes don't even differentiate between an income and a cash flow. They are looking at, and as long as you put liquidity back into the system, you will find your repayment rates go up. So they are really, not able to segregate that. And at the very small loan level, particularly, it becomes more difficult.
Okay. It's a very interesting topic. I would have tried to pick the brains of Manojji and Jay also on this, but in the interest of time, I will move to another dimension of COVID pandemic, and that is the Supreme Court case which is going on. So Manojji, because what we have been seeing is that the definition of NPA is in a limbo. When to classify, when not to classify. The credit discipline is taking, I think, is taking hit, but I would like to hear from you. So what is the situation there on the Supreme Court judgment and its impact on credit bureaus?
Alokji, this matter is sub judice. One needs to be careful talking about it. But having said that, see, I think it's unprecedented that from 1st of September till today, which is 19th of January, right? The court has not allowed us to nominate, to sort of denote any additional customer as actually an NPA. Now, is NPA something that you define as an NPA, or is NPA somebody who crosses 90? Right? Pre-COVID pandemic, certainly the NPA used to be somebody who crosses 90. Right? The fact that even today we are not able to classify has humongous implications. Because at the end of the day, you have a situation where essentially what you've done is 89-day DPD customers, let's say as of 31st of August, have got the benefit of a backdoor moratorium, which continues even today. Right. So I think the learned courts, while I completely respect them and sort of understand where where they're coming from, the fact is that you're not today able to pursue, call anybody in NPA and pursue the legal options that you have because the aging has actually been stopped. And what makes it even more complicated is the fact that we do not have any clear guidelines from our regulator as to what to do. Should we stop aging at 89? Should we submit that data to the credit bureau, or is it just a technical definition of NPA, where it is no longer 90, but it is an open-ended definition now, right? And as somebody rightfully mentioned even earlier, that a bit of coordination again here, because we have people who are paying up on a daily basis. We have collection meetings which happen on a daily basis. Aging is happening on a daily basis. Right. So to that extent, and as a sector, as you know, NBFC MFIs have pushed the envelope in terms of submitting data on a daily basis. So clear directives here in terms of what we need to do. Do we arrest everybody at 89? Do we change the definition of NPA, which now is no longer 90, but is, let's say, open-ended because it's still not closed? Right. I mean, even the judgment has already been arrived at, but it's been held back. So it's not been announced, right? I think RBI has tried to explain to the court that this is a matter of financial services. You need to open up. You need to give us clarity as to what to do. But unfortunately, there are other issues on the table due to which this has not found its way in terms of being announced. It's a very, very, very difficult situation. And unless the intention was actually to give some relief through the back door, it is actually panned out in a way in which it is absolutely bizarre.
Jay, coming to you as a bank, how are you dealing with this situation? And views on this?
So as mentioned by Manoj, it's being sub judice, and we do not have any major such cases in our system where we have a problem, because given our portfolio, we do not have. And most of our customers have now been have paid off. we may have some small portion in the retail portfolio, and we are also in the same boat as all other lenders are.
Okay. Because you referred earlier that certain things done without in short time, or some things I would extend it to a logical corollary. If something done in short time and something done in too long a time, both create a little bit of
Both are
chaos.
correct.
Both create chaos on the ground.
And Alok, and that's true for any finance institution or for any decision.
True.
Anything which is done beyond a reasonable time, okay, and reasonable time is very important. Otherwise, it can go any way, either this way or either that way. So reasonable time is very important
I agree.
because we are currently dealing with the depositors' money, so it's very important for that.
Okay.
Too short and too long is
Okay.
difficult.
Yeah. So I had few more questions, but seeing that it is already 1:40, because I will have to stop. It was a very interesting discussion. But before I stop and take the questions which have come on the chat box, I would request first the audience to put your questions in, because I see only 2 questions, and so I would give at least 10 minutes time for the questions for our panelists. But before we go to the questions, the final round, like the opening round, starting from Veena ji, what are the current pain points in short term to medium term, that is, I would say 3 to 9 months, and what have we learned?
So I'll actually answer your second question first. I think what we've learned is that this industry has more resilience and more ability to innovate than we thought possible. And that creates a lot of potential for this industry to actually, I won't say reinvent, but almost go in for a second transformation, where you can look at a much more broader product suite, both for loans as well as insurance, savings, etc. What are the pain points? I think the pain points are really to, from a regulation perspective, to regulate it as one business rather than as the type of institution. And this is something we've been saying for a long time, so it's not new. The pain points are also, I think, people oriented, and how are we going to combine the continued physical contact with the customer with increased digitization, which again has to come through innovation. So,
thank you. Very valid point. Same questions to every panelist. I will start with Bhaskar, but Bhaskar and Manoj will have an additional subset to this question, that how are the repayments faring? So Bhaskar.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's coming back. It's kind of not right to say that the normalcy is back and then we'll all be at 99.99, in which case none of us will be talking about credit losses. Everything should be kind of fast. It will take time. But what the good is that, as all the external data also shows, there has been a improvement month on month. So every month, I think sequentially has been better than the previous month across the industry. If the trend were to kind of go, I think we will be back to near normalcy, I would say, by March, or probably a couple of months after that. The key learnings, I think, Alok, is that the industry, by and large, in my view, we always moved where do not fix where it is not broken. So it is always a group loan. And we also took pride in saying this group has been with me for 10 years and 15 years and so on and so forth, which by principle itself is wrong. Customers, like in school, kids who have to graduate, I think group loan customers also have to graduate and be treated as customers rather than part of a group. I think Veena was one of the earliest ones to start this model, but as kind of the difficulty of that model is a little different, and hence all of us converged back into, even if it tried, to the group model. I think we will see quite a bit of what I would say innovation, but a forced one. In terms of JLG itself is becoming one-to-one individual, and we think that it isn't that bad. It still works. I think that is what we will see that emerging, and that I think is a key learning out of it. Don't continue to kind of keep doing the group lending 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. Start understanding the customers and start dealing with products. The other key lesson I think I might take from this is that the microfinance has to really become microfinance beyond microcredit. If a customer were financially stable with savings, with adequate insurance, they would have overcome this period of 3 to 6 months far more comfortably than they kind of, first month itself, many of them got struck, second month, third month, they ran out of it. I think as a sector, it is in our own interest that we start looking at microfinance holistically rather than looking at only infusion of credit. I think if these two are combined, I think is quite a bit of a learning. While of course it's coming at a cost. No learning comes usually without any cost. I take it that way, but I think the writing is clear that I think please come back with models which will work tenable as the customers are also graduating, and that will have a pain point. But better to kind of understand how to manage that rather than wanting to live. Don't fix as long as it does not work.
Okay, Manojji, one more point to you. Like Bhaskar said that it has to become microcredit to microfinance. So in microfinance, if a layman like me would understand it to be credit, savings, maybe insurance and payments. So payments is already there. Payments, there are so many channels available. The only thing left is savings and insurance. And insurance also is more or less tied with it. On savings part of it, I would like, along with the earlier questions, I would like you to have another supplementary, because I have always thought about it. The survey shows that the average tier 3 to tier 5 cities, average household income per month is around 8,700 rupees. In that context, is savings and all that more about 500 rupees saving, or it can be really be made meaningful?
No, good questions, Alok. Let me take the first question first, which is what is the takeaway and what the learnings are for all of us. As my fellow panelists have said, clearly, I think each crisis that the sector has gone through from 2010 to 2016 to the natural calamities, whether it's been the Kerala floods or the Cyclone Fani or Cyclone Amphan, and now the COVID pandemic, clearly are teaching us something in terms of what we need to take away from that and actually move into the future. If you ask me what is the biggest learning from the COVID pandemic, it is really tying that we are clearly able to differentiate customers into a high-touch model, which is new to credit, and a low-touch model, which is used to credit. Right? We clearly, like retail banking, have to differentiate customers between class banking and mass banking. Right? And people who are used to credit, people who've been with you for 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles, have to be moved on to a low-touch platform, make their transactions cashless, interact with them only if you need to interact with them. Otherwise, if they're paying you on time, why would you want to bother them? Even a renewal loan can essentially be done today in 4 hours flat. You've got digital signatures that you can take. You have their bank accounts where you can credit the amount, right? Really try to innovate, which is what people like us are trying to do, to differentiate between new to credit, which will need to go through a little bit of discipline so that the payment discipline and the repayment methodology is actually enforced, and then move them onto a platform which is used to credit, which is actually a low-touch model. I think going into the future, if you ask me, Alokji, this is a national question, right? With all the innovation and the different types of institutions we have today, the SHG group, the JLG group, the banks, non-banks, for-profit, not-for-profit. Within banks, you have small finance banks, universal banks, NBFCs, NBFC MFIs. All of us put together, we claim almost about 340,000 crores of credit outstanding today, right? Which we still believe is hardly 1/3 what the potential is. So as a country, are we trying to say that all the innovation, all the IT advancement we've done, all the innovative thinking and the learnings that we have are going to stagnate at this level? And moving from here to the 50%, to the 67% and the 75% is going to be incrementally very, very challenging. So what is it from a regulatory perspective that we need to do? What is it from an individual institution or entity perspective that we need to do is really something that we all need to think. Because otherwise we will be stagnant. For example, in the last 1 year, we've been stagnant at 33%. How do we move it to even a 35, 40 or a 50%? Right? And unless, like our Honorable Prime Minister says, unless we are able to reach credit to the bottom of the pyramid in a very systematized way, rather than the informal lending which is happening today there, right? Holistic development of the country cannot happen. So it's a national priority. And I think the RBI, the Government of India, DFS, institutions like MFIN Sadhan, all of us put together, including practitioners like us, need to think, how are we going to push the envelope in terms of really taking it there.
Okay.
The aspect of risk were already mentioned on the natural calamity and the external event. I think it's high time that we are able to quantify that, come up with a cover which will actually make it easier for both customers as well as lenders, because otherwise it's an unknown, and especially for institutions like us with a fixed margin, it becomes very, very difficult to actually manage. Sorry.
No, I said because we are running out of time, so I will go to Jayesh for his brief closing comments before I go to questions.
Look, I'll be very brief. The only thing which we have seen is that always we thought that the microfinance customers have to be met, have to be touched base on a weekly, nightly or a monthly basis. I think we have learned in a way that there are different ways to keep them in touch. And I think from that learning, we should see how we implement that. And based on technology, we don't lose that touch, but at the same time, we also ensure that that efficiency is being brought. I think that could be the best way, which can address most of the issues which have been right now put up. That's it from my side.
Thank you so much. Now to the questions. The first question is, I will take it to Bhaskar, others can also supplement it. It is said that people are saying that the collection efficiency, some people are saying it has gone up to 90, 95%. But the questioner says that it seems that, or it appears that most of it has been achieved by giving fresh loans to clear the overdues. What is the real picture, sir?
Hello, we have filed our DRHP, so this is from giving any kind of numbers. Okay, so I think as I kind of said, this sector to be treated very differently from the rest of it in terms of whether you're giving a small dose of loan. If that does help them revive their business back, which generates cash flows, which kind of makes them repay, is so far so good. But as Veena was also mentioning, if some of the players use it only to kind of prop up the collection numbers to 99 and 98, then absolutely that's being very irresponsible, not only to masquerading the numbers, but even from the client perspective. So I think it's a very, very thin line between a letter and the spirit. If you are giving in a loan, additional loan, so the customer to get back on track, to giving a loan to increase your collection efficiency, I think left to the respective institutions. I think the regulators, the markets, and everybody, other stakeholders have a way of really differentiating that. Maybe they accept that the time frame for that will not be instant. It may be 3 months and 6 months. What is for sure is that a pandemic like event like this, when you meet in the field, the economic worries have not gone away. It is impossible to say that everything is back and then when as if nothing has changed between February and now. So just stop there. Go to Manoj.
Okay. So Manoj, your take on this question?
No, I agree with Bhaskar that there is a very fine line between evergreening, which I think Veena and Bhaskar spoke about, and a relief product. Right? If a customer is genuinely impacted by COVID, even the RBI has actually come out with a relief measure wanting to help those customers so that they do not become NPAs. Right? That I don't think is evergreening. Evergreening is when you have a customer who's unable to pay and crossed, let's say, even 90 plus, and you're giving him or her a new credit line in order to mask the fact that the old loan had about maybe 3, 4, or 5 installments pending. Right? So clearly in my mind, that is the difference. But so if a customer is 89th day, according to me, she is still kosher. She still needs to be helped so that she doesn't cross 90. But the moment you cross 90, and that's the seriousness that we are trying to create about 90. On collection efficiency and client activation, let me tell you, internally we track a very different metric called client activation. Collection efficiency has been, I would say, abused in terms of the definition, and I smile when I see people talking about 127% collection efficiency. Right? Obviously, you're playing with the numerator and the denominator. What is critical is that out of your 100 customers, how many of them are active? How many of them are fully activated in the sense that they've been able to make a payment of that month's installment in full, and how many are partially activated, and with how many you've had no transaction for the last 30 days. And that, according to me, is still lesser than 90% today. Collection efficiencies, I agree with Bhaskar. People are talking about 90, 95. Some people are even talking about 124, which is a different story. Client activation, because of the fact that there is economic stress down and the economic activity is just about started, not reached the level where she can pay the installments and still take care of our family is what us had to move to that level of 95-100%.
Okay. So, Manojji, this in your longest answer, I would put one bullet question to you. What is the COSER recovery? Any numbers on that? or you will try to?
No, so I think if you remove any additional sections being made and all of that, I would still say it is between 90 to 95%, depending on the geography and depending on the institution that you're talking about. It is still far away from the 98, 99 that we need to be for our model to be viable.
Okay. Now the second question is, I think, more related to the practitioners again. So Manojji, maybe you are a bit the thick of action here, and you are a major player there, so you can answer that. It is though the questioner has asked that given the state level regulation. So let me first clarify: there is no such state level regulation. It is a proposed thing. It is a work in progress. But he is asking that given that initiative which has been taken by the Assam state government, what you feel can be the repercussions, and what has been the initial reaction of investors to this?
Yeah. No, I guess the questioner is speaking about Assam only, right? So to that extent,
Assam,
like Alokji rightly said, the bill is still in a draft form. It has been tabled in the assembly. As far as we know, the governor has not given his assent, and even post that, the detailed guidelines are supposed to come out, post which it becomes effective, right? So it is not effective as yet. I think the larger damage right now is the media misreporting and the confusion being spread in the mind of the customers, which is making them either stop the payment completely or make partial payments, right? I mean, if you remember in the earlier question, Alokji, I mentioned that it's a larger question for all of us as citizens of this country to answer. True. How do we move from that 33, 34, 35% penetration to a healthy 40, 50 or 60%, right? Clearly, what is coming out from the proposed Assam bill are two. One is the fact that, as Veena ji rightly said, it is still entity-based regulation and not activity-based regulation, right? So if NBFC MFIs are completely disciplined and driving very carefully on the highway, you have a very rough rally driver who's driving left, right, and center. It's a matter of time before you get hurt, right? So we are being disciplined by the guidelines, but those guidelines do not apply to anybody else, right? The second aspect that I want to put in here is that somewhere I think that middle ground between the RBI defining the regulations and the state government also being in the know of what is happening on the ground has been missed out. We have repeatedly said, please involve us in the SLBC, please involve us in the DLCC so that we can tell you the practical issues that we have so that you will get to know how many practitioners are there on the ground. That clearly has been missing, right? So these two aspects, if you ask me, is the reason why states like Assam are thinking about getting involved in this business of microfinance. The intention is not to damage, but the misreporting and the confusion creates more of the damage.
And what has been the reaction of investors? Any reaction?
Well, investors are obviously concerned, right? They are asking questions. We are explaining exactly like we are discussing here today. But if the bill does come in, but the one silver lining on the bill is that it say on every clause it says as per RBI guidelines. So if at all any sector has to be or any entity has to be impacted, it is not NBFC MFI. I think it is the others who are not subject to any guideline. So that's the way we are explaining it to our investors. But faster we are able to settle the issue, the better, because there is a large road ahead, especially given the COVID pandemic, where even customers there need credit. The confusion is not going to help anyone.
True.
And clearly, collection rates we had improved from pre-COVID, even in Assam, to a level of 70-80%, have now come down back to around 50%, which is not good. Which is not good for all of us.
Okay. And one final question, which any of you who feels like can take it. It says that, if I understand the question properly, it says that while the restructuring policy generally prescribed by Reserve Bank of India is pan-India, it says that it may not be that effective or may not be suitable to context in states with different contexts, like Punjab is seeing a heightened political activity, or say Assam. is there a need to have a state-specific approach or an institution-wide approach in place of a pan-India approach coming from that? It's a very broad question, but still, if anybody would like to take it.
So, Alokji, if I were to take a first hit at it, the definition for the RBI relief product are customers who are 1 to 30 as of 1st of March, irrespective of which geography they come from. Right? This is an enabling circular available to you and the customer. It doesn't mean that it needs to be done without the customer agreeing or the customer not asking. Right? As we all discussed, it is an unprecedented situation. Whatever needs to be done to help the customer come out of that difficult situation that she is in and get back to normalcy and the mainstream in terms of payment is what needs to be done. Right? The relief product even gives facility for additional credit. The relief product even says that you can extend the tenure so that the monthly obligations come down. Right? Now, each geography, depending on what is the need of the hour at that point of time, is where I guess customers will either avail of it or not avail for it. Some customers don't like the tenure being extended. We are seeing excellent collections in, for example, states like UP, Rajasthan. Maybe customers there may not, might not opt for it. But in Odisha, Assam, West Bengal, where the economic activity is just about revived and picking up momentum, some customers